culture.
For costumed heroes, death is waiting around every corner. And sometimes death, the Marvel Universe's own physical manifestation of the Grim Reaper, is literally waiting around the corner from you with her on-again, off-again boyfriend Thanos. The good thing about dying in a comic book is that it's rarely, if ever, permanent. In his essay, Dead and Recovering Nicely, veteran superhero writer Peter David bemoaned the fact that writers had shot themselves in the foot by bringing back fan-favorite characters too often, to the point that they've robbed themselves of the ability to tell meaningful stories about death, since there's always the unspoken postscript that whoever just popped their clogs will be pushing up daisies for 3 months, tops. That being said, some of those deaths are truly saddening at the time, and so with that in mind, I'm Ben from What Culture, and here are the 10 most tragic deaths in the history of Marvel Comics. Number 10. Victoria Hand. Former head of S.H.I.E.L.D., Victoria Hand was one of the best recent creations in the Marvel Universe. You don't often get creative teams coming up with totally new characters, especially when the Marvel sandbox already includes so many toys with which to play. Hand stood out because she was really bloody cool, and despite only debuting in 2008, quickly became an essential part of the murky behind-the-scenes S.H.I.E.L.D. stuff which keeps this superhero universe ticking over. Victoria Hand was a morally complex and refreshingly progressive character for Marvel, which made it all the more heartbreaking when just 4 years after her first appearance, she was possessed by magician Daniel Drum and got sent to the astral plane where Drum murdered her. She was buried in the backyard of the Avengers Mansion, which now has a statue of her in her memory. Number 9. Colossus. Death is at its most fluid and common in the X-Men books, but that didn't stop us from being totally devastated at the passing of Peter Rasputin, better known as the hulking metal-covered Colossus. Part of the giant-size X-Men Team 2, Colossus was introduced in the comics way back in 1975. From there, readers had watched him grow from a simple Russian farmhand amazed by his powers to a fully-fledged X-Man who'd survived numerous catastrophes and crossovers the team had been put through. All of them except the legacy virus. The virus was one that targeted the mutant gene specifically, and was fatal in almost all cases. It killed off a fair amount of minor X-Men supporting characters until Beast managed to synthesize a cure. Unfortunately, it could only be made airborne with the death of its first ever user, and with his heroic heart, Colossus injected himself with the cure and saved thousands of lives at the cost of his own. Number 8. Karen Page. It became a running joke, especially after Frank Miller took over writing duties, that blind attorney by day, blind vigilante by night, Daredevil, had the absolute worst luck of anybody in the entire Marvel universe, to the point that I suppose they could have thought of him as a shit superhero for wankers, hashtag shit superhero for wankers. But anyway, on to Karen Page. First appearing in Daredevil #1 as Matt Murdock's legal secretary and possible love interest, as time went by she went from one-dimensional eye candy to something much worse. She got addicted to heroin and started acting in porn, and then after finally cleaning herself up, found out she's HIV positive. Appropriately distraught, she seeks out her former lover in a church in New York where Daredevil happens to be doing battle with Bullseye, his archenemy and murderer of his other former lover, Elektra. Deciding to go 2 for 2, Bullseye kills Karen as well, before she can even give Matt the bad news.
Number 7. Captain Marvel. Despite his many adventures with Spider-Man, the Avengers, and his role in the creation of half of the Guardians of the Galaxy, it was eventually cancer that killed Captain Marvel. After fighting a bad guy called Nitro, he was exposed to it in gas form, and it slowly ate away at the superhero as it does in the real world. Despite seeking out some of the more bonkers possible cures on offer as a comic book character, Marvel does succumb to the disease in a full-length graphic novel called The Death of Captain Marvel, which is really bloody depressing.
Number 6. Bucky. There have always been 2 characters that readers knew would never come back from the grave, and one of those was Bucky, Captain America's wartime sidekick who seemingly died in their last adventure. Clinging desperately onto a Nazi drone plane armed with a bomb, Bucky managed to stop the drone from reaching its destination but was killed in the explosion, whilst Cap found himself catapulted into the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, waiting to be thawed out in 20 years or so by the Avengers. As time went by, we were all convinced that Bucky would never come back, to the point that when all the Winter Soldier debacle went down, it was a genuine surprise. However, finding out that he hadn't actually died and what had happened to him in the intervening years instead was somehow even more tragic than if he had been lost in that drone explosion way back in 1945. Number 5. Gertrude Yorks. In The Runaways, a loose team of Californian kids find out their parents are actually a supercriminal dynasty called the Pride, who control all illegal activities in LA and frequently sacrifice young girls in order to satiate the otherworldly beings that gave them their power. Wholesome family fun. It was a not-so-subtle metaphor for the way teenagers tend to hate and misunderstand their parents, but it was a great one, and seeing this mismatched collection of adolescents trying to figure out both their burgeoning superpowers and their hormones was a delight. Perhaps most delightful was Gert, the slightly geeky, slightly chubby brains of the operation who didn't have any powers to speak of, besides her psychic link to a giant velociraptor from the future, of course. Gert, along with her boyfriend Chase, formed the heart of the team. After initially being pretty cynical and tough to read, her development as a character and relationship with Chase served to make it all the more tragic when she gets murdered protecting her boyf from a new incarnation of the Pride. Number 4. Uncle Ben. If Bucky was one of the two characters that Marvel fans could always bet would never be resurrected, Uncle Ben is the other. Unlike Bucky, however, Marvel have thankfully never undone one of the most tragic and arguably one of the most important deaths in their history. Were it not for the accidental murder of Peter Parker's uncle by a mugger, then his nephew might never have learned the lesson of with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Uncle Ben's death, while important, doesn't get away with not being totally heartbreaking. We only meet Ben for a handful of pages in Spidey's surprisingly short origin story in Amazing Fantasy number 15, but he makes enough of an impression for the panel of Peter mourning his death to really get you right here. That's me slapping my chest. Flashbacks have since filled in some of the details of the uncle and nephew's relationship, revealing Ben as an unfailingly kind and loving man who was adored not only by his family, but by the community at large. Number 3. Charles Xavier. The Avengers vs. X-Men crossover event was either totally epic or totally rubbish, depending on who you talk to, but there's no mistaking that it made for some huge changes in the status quo of both teams. The battle suffered casualties on both sides, and as it turned out, the worst fatalities happened to the X-Men themselves. Charles Xavier has died before, but while under the semi-control of the Phoenix Force and advancing towards Cyclops' daughter, Cyclops intercepted and killed his longtime mentor and father figure. The results of this can still be felt across several comics, but one thing remains constant. Everybody's really angry at Scott Summers for killing Professor X. Number 2. Gwen Stacy. There are so many levels as to why the night Gwen Stacy died is so flipping tragic. The first thing is the circumstances under which Gwen met her maker. Norman Osborn is a total jerk, one who delights in torturing Peter Parker whenever he gets the chance, frequently turning his nemesis' already messy life into a living hell. But perhaps the cherry on top of all this tragedy is that we still don't actually know how Gwen died. And what's haunted both Spider-Man and his fans for decades is one little detail, a sound effect that accompanies Peter desperately grabbing Gwen's leg as she falls. A little snap that appears next to her thigh as the webbing clings to it. Some people think that's just the sound of the web attaching itself to her. Others, however, think it's the sound of her neck snapping at the sudden stop, which would mean Spidey himself killed her. Number 1. Jean Grey. After one of her many deaths, she was chosen and resurrected by the Phoenix as its new host, boosting her already impressive psychic abilities and letting her do all that there cosmic fire stuff as well, during which time she destroyed an inhabited star system. Put on trial for mass genocide, Jean and her fellow X-Men are ordered to fight to the death against their accuser's greatest champions. Ultimately, Jean chose to end her own life, terrified of what the Phoenix Force might get her to do next. She explains her choice to her long-suffering and tearful husband Scott, before activating a weapon and vaporizing herself. It hardly matters that the many deaths of Jean Grey have become a running joke in comic book fandom. This is still one of the most tragic endings to any character we've ever seen. And that's our list. Are there any we missed off? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You can even follow me here on Twitter if you fancy. I'm Ben from What Culture, and thanks for watching.